This month is Fair Housing Month, and our program today is entitled Words Matter, and it focuses on this very important topic of fair housing. I would like to introduce LaTanya Davis, who is she's both a member of our board of directors as well as our diversity, equity, and inclusion chair. And she has been a realtor for 14 years, working with Empowerment Incorporated as the operations manager there. And LaTanya is very dedicated to the fair housing programs as well as affordable housing. LaTanya has put together a wonderful resource guide for our association and our members. And if you find that you have a need, you have a client who has a need for affordable housing, please contact our association or LaTanya directly to give you some assistance and get that resource guide out to you. Without further ado, LaTanya, please go ahead and introduce our very special guest speaker today.
Thank you, Jessica. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Nicole Furnace today to our board of directors and our OCHAR members. Nicole is a strategic real estate advisor and developer focused on providing fellow colleagues in the real estate industry the tools and techniques that lead to a more equitable, just, and inclusive real estate environment. Her boutique consultancy works with government agencies, real estate companies, professionals, real estate associations, and corporate clients across the U.S. In her 15-year career, Nicole has balanced her advisory, consulting, and coaching roles with being the chief executive officer of her own residential real estate development firm, focused on incremental development, missing middle housing, preserving affordable housing, and intentional placemaking. In addition to her project work, Nicole is a sought-out after facilitator and speaker, regularly discussing topics of missing middle housing, sustainable affordable housing, equity in real estate, and the value of small-scale incremental development. Nicole holds an MBA from the University of Texas at Austin and a BA from the University of Southern Cal. She is a licensed real estate professional in North Carolina, Virginia, and Washington, D.C. Thank you, Nicole, for being here today, and take it away.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to be here in this virtual environment with you all during Fair Housing Month. As we know, there are a lot of different topics and situations that we end up within when it comes to fair housing considerations as we are in our professions and working with clients and customers in these different scenarios that can be challenging. We are in the spring market, so I know it's very busy. So I really appreciate your time to listen and participate with us today. So I do have a presentation, and it'll be part presentation, but really we want participation. So feel free to jump in with questions, raise your hand virtually, raise your hand kind of in person, put questions in the chat. We really want this to be an inclusive, good dialogue about fair housing and racial considerations when it comes to equity in real estate. So I'm going to share my screen so you can see the presentation I have. So can everyone see there? All good? All right, perfect. So I'm going to run through some slides, but again, like I said, we really do want this to be a discussion, and we're going to get a lot out of it when everyone has a chance to participate and share some of their ideas as we go. So I just want to let you know kind of what to expect during our time together. So I have an agenda and some ground rules. So primarily we're going to talk about the Fair Housing Act. As we know, and Jessica mentioned, it is Fair Housing Month. And of course, April is not the only month we think about fair housing. We do it every day in our jobs as we're working with our customers and clients. We're also going to talk about the context of fair housing today and why it's still relevant and important to keep these kinds of concepts at the forefront of our work that we do. We're really the first line of defense as realtors in protecting the rights of people that we're interacting with on both sides of the transaction to ensure that their rights are equally represented. And then we're going to get more into our program. why words matter. And this is, again, something that we have a very strong influence in as we work with customers and clients. A lot of times, you know, it's a lot of communication that goes on, right? When we're talking and interacting with people, a lot of fast moving things. And sometimes you might say things that we didn't mean or came off the wrong way or someone interpreted in a way that we didn't mean. And that's just going to be a common theme of what we talk about today, the intent versus impact. And so this is going to be a good kind of context as we think about the words that we use and how we communicate with people and thinking about that intent versus impact. We always want to assume that everyone has good intentions when they're interacting with people, communicating with people. But sometimes you say things that you're like, oops, did not mean to say that, or oh, they took it the wrong way, or I didn't mean it to come across like that. And so we're going to kind of share some of those experiences and then talk about how we get through them and also transition into building a language that can be a little bit more inclusive and changing our vocabulary and how we speak to people and interact with people and changing those communication tones that we have. Part of that is using inclusionary language. And so we're going to talk about some guidance around inclusionary language, some tips, and then we're going to get into some examples and really have a discussion about some terms that we use when we're talking about people and property and how we can, and neighborhoods and how we can change some of those terms that we use. And we really do want to have a discussion around this, so feel free to participate. We're also going to talk about coded language. And so this is sometimes terms that we use in our profession that we think doesn't have a positive or negative impact, but it does. And so we're going to talk about how that can impact the people that we're interacting with when we use those terms. And then we're going to talk about one of our favorite topics as realtors, buyer letters. As we know, this is a hot topic recently, and also just kind of the time of the year in the spring market. Everyone's buying after that same house, and they want to write a letter to build some kind of connection to the seller. And a lot of times that does put us at risk as real estate professionals, but it also can have a negative impact in the policies that we're trying to protect when it comes to discrimination in fair housing. And so again, we are that first line of defense in the real estate industry when it comes to protecting these rights of individuals and our clients and customers. And most importantly, this is just the beginning. So this is a lot of information. This is not just a one and done kind of topic. This is going to be an ongoing discussion. And I really am appreciative of OCHAR welcoming me to talk to the membership and really kind of open up the door to having these discussions so that we can build on our professional skills in this way. So now I just want to talk about some of the ground rules. We do want to encourage, you know, this is a safe space. We're all learning and kind of want to have these fruitful discussions. And so everyone should feel comfortable sharing their experiences, asking questions. Even if you're unsure, uncertain, if you want to talk to me afterwards, I'm happy to kind of have those conversations privately. But sharing your experiences is really going to help the overall community of realtors. And that's what we want to do. We want to build our knowledge base in these areas. And by sharing your shared experiences or clarifying any questions that people might have, that's really how we're going to get the most out of this. Nobody knows everything, including me. Don't tell my kids, but even I don't know everything. So again, we're not trying to convince someone of something. It's not an argument. We're not trying to get anyone to agree. We really just want to gain a deeper understanding on these topics. Participation is key. So feel free to participate to the extent that you feel comfortable. When you talk and participate, speak from a position of your own personal experience, and we want to avoid generalizing because we want to hear different people's experiences and don't want to exclude them based on any general kind of comments that people make. Again, it's not personal. These are all kind of experiences that we've had in this world. There are no personal attacks. We're not going to personally have any personal attribution to any stories that are shared here. I'm here to make people uncomfortable because we're going to talk about some uncomfortable things, and it's okay. As we were young and we were growing, it was a little painful. We had growing pains, right? So some of these topics and some of these things that we're going to discuss maybe have not been discussed in this forum, especially when it comes to real estate. And so this is going to be an area where you might feel uncomfortable or unsure sometimes, and that's okay. That's a positive indication that we're moving in the right direction. Again, it's a process. It's not a one and done, check the box kind of thing. And we know that these topics can be heavy sometimes, and we're in the height of the spring market. So I wanted to start off with something a little bit light and entertaining. So I have a brief video that kind of recaps a market that we're in right now, if you all want to take a look and see with me. All right. Let me share my screen with you. Some of you might have seen this already, but I think it's worth seeing twice. It's pretty funny.
Excuse me, is that apple for sale? Yeah, we're about to put it on sale right now, actually. Well, I'm in the market, so tell me about your apple. Why should I buy it? Nice try. Okay, people, here's how this is gonna work. I have an apple here. The highest bidder's going home with this. I want all bids in the next 2 minutes, then we're closing it. Bidding starts at $5. Feeling pretty confident there, huh? I mean, don't you $10. He said starting at 5. 15. Is this a new apple? Yeah, just listed. I'm pre-qualified. I'll pay cash. I got cash. 20, 30, 40. No, just make it 45. Is it even worth that? 50. I don't know. Please, this is the 8th apple I've tried to buy. Could I at least see it up close? Nope, it's an apple. You know what it is. You either want it or you don't. I'll take it for 100. What? I'm from California. It's the cheapest apple I've ever seen. It was 120. Why did I do that? Why? I don't. Excuse me.
All right. So that was a little real estate humor as we get started. I'm sure you all can relate to that in this market.
Is that apple for sale?
Oh, sorry. All right, hold on 1 second. I'll get back to the presentation here. All right. Okay, so before we get started, does anyone have any comments or questions or anything, want to add anything to the agenda or ground rules as we move into the presentation? Okay, so I'm just going to start off with an overview of the Fair Housing Act. I'm sure everyone is familiar with, but the Fair Housing Act prohibits discrimination in the sale, rental, and financing of housing based on race, color, national origin, religion, sex, familial status, and disability. The Act has 2 main purposes: to prevent discrimination and reverse housing segregation. And so we know that this is a core tenet of the work that we do, and the Fair Housing Act was federal legislation that protected certain classes that are named here and their rights when it comes to seeking housing, rental and for sale housing. And as we know, there was some resistance during the time that this was passed in 1968. And there's some great kind of stories in history around that, getting that Civil Rights Act passed. But there's still a strong need for housing, fair housing considerations as we continue in our industry today. I've included a link to a video so you all can look at that on your own. I just want to make sure that we have enough time to get through everything. So a lot of people don't know why the Fair Housing Act was necessary. A lot of neighborhoods during this time were segregated. A lot of communities were not welcoming to people that were different from them. Steering, redlining. I know Jessica sent out a video to the membership about redlining and blockbusting. These were kind of 3 of the big things related to what pushed the Fair Housing Act through. There were also unequal and unfair lending practices, exclusionary advertising, and a variety of other things surrounding the real estate industry that was just blatant discriminatory as people were seeking housing in their communities. I've included a quote from someone who grew up in the Detroit area and whose parents had trouble finding a home, which we don't even think about today as that being a challenge of someone wanting to buy a home and not being able to find a place to live that's welcoming and inclusive for them. But this was a reality back in the day, and this wasn't too long ago, right? 1967. And so we do have to think about these things are recent in our history, and so there's still a lot of progress to be made. And we were not excluded in the Triangle when it came to housing discrimination. Durham was one of the cities in the Triangle that was redlined. And so I'm sure that you're familiar with the term redline, but it's different when you actually see a community that you're familiar with and you see the maps associated with neighborhoods that were excluded from federal lending practices. And so green is go, basically, if anyone wanted to buy a house in this And the neighborhoods that were outlined as green, there were no kind of challenges or issues in getting a home loan. The yellow areas were kind of iffy when it came to lending, and the red areas were no-go areas where banks would not be issuing loans to anyone who wanted to buy in that community. So you can see where this cycle of disinvestment would happen just based on these, lending practices when it came to different areas in the community in Durham.
Nicole, it's a little bit difficult to see the map on my screen. I wonder if you could just
Yeah.
pick up a couple of areas so that we can actually relate. Thank you.
Yeah. So this is, for instance, this is kind of the Walltown area of Durham. This is East Durham. So Hayti kind of community near NCCU. Over here, you can see the majority of these areas are red and yellow, the historically Black neighborhoods. And even if you overlay kind of a current day map to these areas, you'll still see the disparities and the effects of the redlining today. So for instance, in a lot of these green areas that you see, the city invested in neighborhood beautification policies, right? So you'll see a lot of trees planted in the green neighborhoods and no, greenery and landscaping and hardscaping done in those red areas. And so the disinvestment wasn't just when it comes to lending for homes in those areas, it also came down to the city level when it came to investment in those communities, and access to grocery stores, to supporting small businesses, to putting sidewalks in those areas, transit lines, things like that. And so all of these things contributed to how our neighborhoods have been formed today. Also, zoning is another kind of exclusionary way that people were discriminated against back in the day. And a lot of these laws are still on the books in communities in the Triangle. This is just an example. This is, again, a neighborhood in Durham, Hope Valley, that I'm sure most people are familiar with. I know it's hard to see. I put a link here so that people can reference as well. This is a restricted deed for a house in Hope Valley in 1926, the beginning of Hope Valley. So two things to note here. Number one, a house costs $7,500. That's not so bad. And number two, and most importantly, the seventh covenant of this deed was no person of color, no person of Negro or Negro blood would be allowed to live on the premises. This was less than 100 years ago, and these deeds are not, this is not a rare occurrence. So there were deeds in Hope Valley, other neighborhoods in Durham, Chapel Hill, the Triangle, where these types of restrictions were the norm back in the day. And so you can see kind of all these different reasons why the Fair Housing Act came to be. This is just an example from Raleigh of kind of the history of real estate and land holding. I'm not sure how many people are familiar, but Cameron Village recently has been renamed and they're now going by the term Village District. They've decided to drop the name Cameron. Duncan Cameron was one of the wealthiest people in North Carolina, and back in the day, wealth usually was connotated with land holding and also holding of enslaved people. And so there is kind of this reckoning that we're seeing in the Triangle of understanding where and how people came into land and how that land was developed, and finding a way to balance honoring the history of and the people that worked on the lands, in this case, enslaved people, and also understanding kind of the history associated with the family legacies and those names associated with, and why that can be impactful, right? This is similar to what we saw last summer when we saw people protesting, and a lot of that was these visual representations of people that were oppressive to other communities, right? So the statues that people wanted to be removed or, torn down. This is a similar idea. And in real estate, there are a lot of things that are named after people that had an impact in our communities, and unfortunately were slaveholders. And so kind of reckoning and reconciling the history associated with that in our real estate communities. Did anyone have questions about Cameron Village or Hope Valley or Durham? I just want to make sure, feel free to jump in with questions or comments as we go as well.
Actually in a attorney's office a few years back, and they had an old map of the city of Durham from an insurance company, and it was broken out into different areas, and it was clear to identify Black churches on the map, I assume, because they were a greater fire risk, because this was like turn of the 19th century, I think, when the map was written. So interesting to see it. It wasn't just in lending. There was discrimination in a lot of financial aspects.
Right. Oh, go ahead. Was there someone else?
Yes, Nicole. The deed restrictions that appeared in so many deeds, obviously that's now illegal. But was there specific legislation that removed that, or is it all under the federal legislation that removed at least invalidated those covenants against racial discrimination?
That's covered, I mean, partially under the Fair Housing Act, but over time, as you see land getting transferred and real estate getting transferred, those deed restrictions would go away. But if you still go to the recorder of deed offices in a variety of different communities, in North Carolina, you're still going to be able to see these on paper. So it didn't erase them. And, some properties you can kind of trace back these
Right.
deed restrictions, especially based on the neighborhood that they're in, where it was kind of obvious discrimination and restrictions associated with the people living in those communities or people that they wanted to exclude from those communities. So they are illegal today, but there's still record of those. And I know we're moving, it's a lot of information to go through. I've included some links, and Ochar will share this with everyone as we wrap up today. And so, of course, Chapel Hill is not excluded from some of these policies. Is anyone familiar with Senator Howard Lee and his story? I've included that here. So Senator Lee, he was a state senator prior to becoming the mayor of Chapel Hill. He was the first Black mayor of Chapel Hill, and he was actually motivated to get into public service based on his experience and looking for a house when he moved to Chapel Hill with his family in the 60s. He couldn't even find a realtor to represent him and his family to find a house. There was only one person he could find to represent him, to show him houses, and in a place that he felt welcomed in Chapel Hill. And he ended up living in Colony Woods with his family. But he even says, for the next year, we lived there under threat of death. Our kids were threatened when they went to school. And so a lot of people, I think, associate Chapel Hill or Carrboro with a very progressive mindset, but just in the mid 60s, there was still a very unwelcoming community when it came to people of color. And so a lot of those kind of threads are still there. They're just kind of an undercurrent instead of maybe something more obvious. So I don't know, based on your experiences, has anyone had any challenges in working in Orange County or Chatham County in today's environment when it came to fair housing or discrimination? And working with other realtors or clients, customers? No one? No one's had any issues? That's amazing.
I think that, again, Nicole, it's really difficult because we don't see it necessarily, but it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I think a lot is unsaid and unspoken. And, if any of you have watched the Newsday presentation, the point came up that it wouldn't be noticed because you don't have two different sets of buyers coming and asking for the same thing. So we don't see it unless it's tested.
Well, Nicole, I live in Pittsburgh, and unfortunately, until just recently, there was a giant Confederate flag that flew at one of the entrances into Pittsburgh, and I was showing a Black family homes in Pittsburgh, and when we drove by that Confederate flag, Arthur asked me, he said, "Are we going to be welcome here?"
Right.
So there's when the first time I saw the flag, it infuriated me, but you drive by it every day and you forget it's even there. And then someone new comes along and sees it and they say, are we in the right community? And I'm sitting there going, wow, so obviously there's some issues out there that unfortunately, when you're white, you don't necessarily, it doesn't impact you the same way as it might be if you were colored, Black, person of color, whatever. So that was sort of an eye opener that you then have to explain that, okay, yes, you would be welcome here. Yes, this is an inclusive community. Yes, there are people who don't necessarily agree with that. And I think you're going to find that everywhere.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you for sharing that story. I do think it's important to note that there are some overt symbols of that, like the flag is an obvious one of kind of not being welcomed or included in a community. And like Jessica was mentioning, there are some things that are a little bit more covert that is just kind of in the normal flow of things. It's not as obvious to us. And we don't want to get too comfortable with accepting those kind of symbols. We want to be able to, again, serve as advocates to our clients and our customers when we're representing them in these transactions, and making sure that they understand that, you know, it's our job to protect their rights as realtors. So speaking of that, realtors were not immune from discrimination. This quote, Article 34, was from the Realtor Code of Ethics from the 1920s. And so a realtor should never be instrumental in introducing into a neighborhood a character of property or occupancy, members of any race or nationality, or individuals whose presence would clearly be detrimental to property values in that neighborhood. So that's in black and white in the Realtor Code of Ethics. Again, this is history, but it's also recent history. And so we do have to remember that even in our professional organizations, this was something that was prevalent in the way that people did business not too long ago in this industry. And so we have to we have to actively work to be sure that we're, again, protecting the rights of our clients and customers and standing up for what's right in this sense. They did change it in 1950. They took out the part about race and nationality, but the idea of it was still the same, unfortunately. And this is just an illustration of some talking about neighborhoods in San Francisco when it came to renting, and how basically, and this is not exclusive of San Francisco, but in other neighborhoods, there were caps to, you know, how many people of color were allowed in a certain neighborhood, and landlords would get together and decide how many people of color from different nationalities or ethnicities they would rent to. And so this is something that we see in a variety of different ways in our industry, whether it's in a commercial sense, in a residential sense for people buying, or in a residential sense of people renting. These kind of things were prevalent in our industry. And while the Fair Housing Act is great, and it was a great start to kind of recognize the need to address this kind of discrimination, unfortunately, it's still very necessary today because there's not been a lot of progress when it comes to addressing this wealth gap and kind of the way that homeowners of color or people that are seeking homes of color are treated, and the progress that they've made as far as home ownership. And so in 1968, you can see that the rate of home ownership was about 66% for white families and about 40% for Black families. And today that rate has not changed at all, unfortunately. So although we do have the Fair Housing Act on the books, we can see that there's still lots of hurdles to Black families, communities of color, really being able to have that home ownership dream, being able to rent where they need or want to rent. These disparities are adding to the wealth gap that we see in our country, and other kind of issues that have come to the forefront in the last year across the US. And so, as we know, homes are one of the keys to building wealth. And there's still this huge disparity between Black and white families, as I'm talking about just those two groups right now, but a huge disparity in the type of capabilities financially that families have when it comes to this, as far as access to wealth and home ownership. And you can see that there's still, thousands, tens of thousands of fair housing complaints that are filed on a regular basis. And so there's still people being mistreated. There's still lots of work that we can do as professionals, again, to protect our clients and our customers in our communities. And so ideally, we want to see that as zero, but that's not going to happen. But this is still a very large problem that's happening in our industry today. And I know Jessica mentioned the Long Island experiment. And so I just wanted to highlight some of those outcomes of that. One of the biggest things is that they tested various different racial groups, and Black testers were still the largest group that experienced unequal treatment. So about 50% of the time. And again, we're going back to, my agenda when I was talking about intent versus impact. A lot of times when people are interacting with people, customers or clients, we don't think that we're doing anything that's discriminatory or offensive, but the impact is there. And right, so we have to have that kind of mindset when we're thinking about our communication with people, how we interact with people, any kind of implicit bias that we have, or if we see things happening that we don't think is right, we do have to intervene in those kinds of situations, because unequal treatment in the real estate industry is still prevalent today. So I know that was a lot of information. I just want to take a break to see if anyone has any comments or questions, or want to dive deeper into anything that I've talked about with relation to the Fair Housing Act. Okay. And so of course here, we're here to talk about words matter. This is just one component of trying to be a positive force of change in this area. Words have direct and indirect impacts, and that's what we want to talk about today. There are things that we say, and when we communicate them, they can be received in a offensive or hurt way. And so we really want to kind of, adjust our mindset to think about how we're communicating to people and what impact it's going to have when we talk about people or talk to people. I do have a video that I can share, and it's talking about microaggressions. And this is really a good way to illustrate how sometimes the things that we say to people is not taken in the way that we intended, and it can be hurtful, and how to deal with those situations. So I will share that with you all.
What are microaggressions? Microaggressions is a pretty big group of things to talk about, but specifically the definition we're working with are actions and or statements that can be intentional or unintentional that ultimately show discrimination and bias. Microaggressions occur with most people because a lot of us have biases that we're not even aware of. And something else we're also not aware of is the amount of diversity that's around us. But diversity has a lot of different levels and layers to it. That may not only just be race or gender, it may be in all kinds of things, just the area where you grew up, or maybe religious factors, things like that. So, some very common ones that we hear oftentimes in our culture are things like, where are you from, or where are you really from, as a follow-up question. We can't eat here, this place is too ghetto. Or even a very common one we hear often, oh, these things are too gay, when we're saying we don't like something. So a lot of these things are considered to be common slang terms or colloquialisms a lot of us use to express our emotions, but we don't realize how offensive they actually are. But you're going to not only figure out how to address and change the bias within ourselves, but also to feel empowered to create change in your environment. You're not only creating change within yourself, but you're also changing the world around you. And I think that at large will be able to change the world as a whole.
All right. Any thoughts or comments after looking at that video? Was someone saying something? No. Okay. And so I'm sure that, everyone's kind of been in a situation where you said something and afterwards you think, oops, maybe I shouldn't have said that. And so that's, the context that we're thinking of when we are talking about words matter. It's not that the intent is to hurt anyone, but there are some things that we say or the ways that we communicate to people where the intent is impactful to the person that we're speaking to. And so we want to kind of identify those opportunities to adjust our language in the ways that we communicate so the impact is positive, and we feel empowered with the language that we're using when we communicate. And so Inclusive language, I'm just going to kind of talk about a little bit about the definition, then we can have a discussion about some specific terms. Inclusive language avoids biases, slang, or expressions that discriminate against groups of people based on race, gender, or socioeconomic status. Inclusive language allows you to resonate with more audiences by speaking and writing in more impartial ways. And so, in the video, the lady was saying, a lot of times we say things or use terms that we don't think are offensive or just so ingrained in us that when we say it, it's not anything that we even think twice about. So similar to what Pat was saying, you've driven past that flag so many times, you don't even think about it anymore until someone points it out to you. And so a lot of times when we do say something that's impactful negatively to someone, we might not even know it. And so it's nice to just kind of change our communication and the way that we speak so that we don't have to question or have second thoughts about, am I saying something that's, offensive, or, should I not use that word? Is that word okay to use? And so that's part of the discussion I want to have today with everyone. If there are, terms or kind of words that you're not sure about or how to refer to things or people, this is really the forum where we can have those discussions amongst our peers again in a safe space. And then
Nicole,
yep.
I think that Sonata here has a question. She had her virtual hand up, and so I wanted to make sure we didn't move
Okay, go
without
ahead.
Unmute. Yes, it was regarding to the previous recording. It was just about a lot of people, like not a lot, most of the time ask me, where are you from?
Mm-hmm.
So that is something that I never thought that something offensive in the recorded could be considered that way, but it may be because I'm coming from a different background culture, and it could be for me just, okay, I'm originally from Panama. It's normal for me. So how would that be considered if it was just to a Native African American or that was born here? That would be considered offensive?
Does anyone else have comments? I can jump in, but I want to make sure everyone in the audience has a chance to participate as well.
Yeah, I have a comment about that because it caught my attention as well. I ask people that all the time. I'm always very curious when I hear an accent, or even, somebody, from the United States who, is from a different region, and you hear a different accent. It's more of a curiosity. And I think nothing of that. I don't think that it would be offensive for somebody to say, where they're from, and that it would open doors for communication. Why is that offensive?
So I can give you my perspective. I moved here about 4 years ago, and I've noticed that in my interactions with people here, the first thing they ask is your name. The second thing they ask is, are you from here? And that to me is a very exclusionary question, because it's conveying a sense that I don't belong. And so for you, you might be asking out of curiosity and just kind of trying to find a commonality, or you have an interest in kind of learning more about me. But for me, when I receive that, it's kind of like, oh, where are you from? You don't belong here. You're not from here. And so again, intent versus impact, right? We want to think about how what we're saying is impacting the person that's receiving the information. And so there's a way to learn about, if you hear someone with an accent or curious about where someone lived before, there's a way to have those discussions without asking the specific question, where are you from? And that's a great example of adjusting your language.
Can you give some examples of a more inclusionary way to ask that question?
Yeah, but specifically, since from a real estate standpoint, I want to know if someone's from California when they're looking at a value here, so that I understand where they're coming from a real estate need standpoint and communicate. So I don't want to do that in a way that's not inclusionary, but at the same time, there is information that will help me guide the process. So, what do we say? How do we handle that?
Right. And we do have to balance that, right? Because we do have, certain kind of responsibilities in our job in collecting information. And so you can say things like, what brings you here? We want to make it kind of a positive question, right? What brings you here? What attracts you to this area? How can I help you? It doesn't have to be specifically about the person, maybe about their intent in coming here, right? So when we're communicating with people, if we kind of depersonalize our communication and not make it so specific to the person, but really more about the situation or the context. And then you do eliminate a lot of opportunities to offend someone personally in that way. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
Any other questions? Oh, go ahead.
Well, Nicole, I'm a really old realtor. I've been doing this 50 years. And so when I first started into real estate, it was right after the 68 Civil Rights Act. And it was the big push in the realtor organization to start training realtors about, non-discrimination and no steering and that sort of stuff like that. But one of the things that happens as I've gotten older is I've been through this whole series of what is the polite and correct way to refer to people. When I started in 1968, people who were Black were referred to as colored people. That was the NAACP, was the National Association of Advancement of Colored People. So some of us have picked up words in the past that maybe are offensive now, and we don't even know it. So
Exactly.
can you speak to that?
Yes, absolutely. And that's the forum, and what we want to talk about is if there are words that you're not sure about or questions or terms that you're not sure about, this is definitely the place to ask those questions, and we can have that discussion.
Okay.
Any other comments or questions about inclusive language in general and kind of ways to adjust our communication styles around that? Okay. And so this, Pat, this is kind of referring to what we were talking about when we are doing inclusive language. We want inclusive language to acknowledge diversity and honor and respect people, right? We want to be sensitive to differences. And this is in all ways that we communicate. We're going to communicate with people in a variety of ways. It's going to be on the phone, it's going to be via text, it's going to be email, it's going to be in a group setting, in a one-on-one setting. And so it's a lot of kind of ways that we communicate with people, and we have to keep track of how we're adjusting what we're saying, and want to keep the impact in mind. And so again, it's not just kind of a one and done thing. This is definitely a process, and we have to, relearn some of the ways that we use terms or words or ask questions, like we were talking about with the, where are you from question. And we also, there's so much language that's embedded in terms that's embedded in just our everyday language that when we speak with people, but also professionally in real estate, there are a lot of terms that are tied to, again, land ownership, ownership of enslaved people, the way that land and property came into the current hands of owners, especially in the region that we're working in. And so just want to be kind of considerate of the history associated with that and the language that we use around those types of situations. And so the really key, oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, Nicole, I see a couple of comments in the chat here.
I'll go for it.
As I heard the term master bedroom may be changing. And I see that, I think it's great how we all kind of jump in the chat and answer each other's questions. Our members are really good about that. But I didn't know if that was something you wanted to speak on, since I know that it's been talked about pretty heavily lately.
Exactly. And so that's actually going to be our next part. We're going to do, so I'll skip this. We'll come back to it. It's just some guidance on inclusionary language. But this is, I want to take some time to go through some examples and talk about some specific words or terms that people might want to discuss further or have questions on. I put some examples in here, and also we can talk in specific about some real estate terms and brainstorm some alternatives, especially when it comes to, the term that you were just using earlier that was in the chat. So a lot of the terms that we're using and what Pat alluded to is that the way that we refer to people is shifting and changing. We want to make sure that the language that we're using is inclusive to the people that we're communicating and interacting with and have professional and personal relationships with. And so this is, again, this is not a comprehensive list of every kind of, person or way that you refer to people. This is something that's evolving and changing, and just something to use as a guide. And I'm happy to add to any kind of list that we have here to make it as inclusive as we can have it. So historically, people of Asian descent were sometimes referred to as Oriental. I still hear that word today, unfortunately. That's not a term that I would say is, a mainstream term that we want to use. If you're not sure where someone is and you think that they're of Asian descent, or you're not sure, don't assume they're Asian, right? We can't assume just how someone looks, what their ethnicity is. But if you do know that someone is of Asian descent, feel free to, refer to the country that they originate from or their ethnicity. It's also okay to ask people to make sure that, they're comfortable with the way that you're referring to them. As long as you do it in a respectful way, I think that people would really appreciate that kind of consideration. As you know, with our changing demographics and customer and client base, there are more people coming from different countries that are living and working in the Triangle. Some people refer to them as foreigners, which again is not a very inclusive word. It makes people feel excluded, using the word foreigner. So immigrant is a nicer term and more respectful term to use in that sense. Ethnic is, some people refer to that kind of as a catch-all for people that are not white. We can use person of color or multiracial person in lieu of that. Elderly is a term that refers to people over a certain age. We can just say older adult. We don't have to say elderly because some people might find that term offensive. Indian, and when I say Indian, I'm referring to what's commonly referred to as American Indians. Indian is a term that I've noticed is still used here kind of in conversation, but also officially in North Carolina. Native Americans are still referred to as Indians in kind of government context. And so Indian is really, again, just not accurate, and some people find it offensive. So Native American, First Nation person, or Indigenous person is a more reflective term to use. When we're talking about a disabled person or someone with a disability, we want to focus on not categorizing that person as disabled, but maybe a person with a disability. And so just changing the mindset and how we're communicating and using terms when it comes to identifying people, whether it's their ethnicity, where they're from, what language they speak, things like that, not categorizing people in generalities. As we know, we're working with people that are partnered up. We should not assume that everyone is married. If they are with a partner, we should not assume that a man is married to a woman. And so a more general term to use is partner that just kind of encompasses any kind of relationship of someone buying or renting with someone else. There is, as you know, a lot of kind of racial justice terms being thrown around. A lot of people still use the term slaved, and a more accurate term is enslaved, so an enslaved person. We're trying to get away from he, she, and these gendered terms, and they is just a better pronoun. Even if you're not sure of the gender of someone, if I'm communicating with people just in a business sense or a personal sense, sometimes people misgender me if they don't see me and they think that I'm a male for some reason. Just don't assume based on someone's name, how someone looks, your interactions with people. You should not assume what their gender is. And this, of course, is something that's changing and evolving, and we can have a completely separate kind of workshop and discussion on this topic as well. Any questions here?
Nicole, I have difficulty with some of these, for example, a husband-wife scenario, referring to somebody as a partner. Would you suggest that we just listen to how people introduce themselves and then follow suit rather than assuming partner? Because that could be, to me, I'm not my husband's partner. Well, I am my husband's partner, but I refer to myself as his wife.
Mm-hmm. Right. And that's what you do. But that's, again, we want to be inclusive and respect other people's desires and interests. And so just because someone is married, those terms husband and wife have very specific kind of gender traditional connotations to them. And there are people that don't feel like they fit into those categories. And spouse or partner is a little bit more inclusive term. And so again, we're speaking from our own personal experiences, and I appreciate you sharing your perspective, but we want to make sure that our vocabulary and the way that we're communicating with people is welcoming to everyone. And so if someone's referring to their partner as husband and wife, feel free to follow suit. Generally, if I meet a couple that I'm working with, of course, we have to kind of ask if they're married for legal reasons when we're working with clients that are buying property. But if I'm not sure, I usually just say partner, because you don't know if someone's married, you don't know kind of what their situation is. Partner is a word that's probably the safest bet, and then just follow their lead after that.
Okay.
Nicole, my daughter is married to a woman as well, and they introduce each other as each other's wives, which some people still find confusing and whatnot, or this is my spouse and whatnot, and I always raise eyebrows sometimes with people because I now introduce my daughter's wife as my daughter-in-law, and that and this is Brinkley's spouse and our daughter-in-law Alicia, and people go, and it's sort of like, you have to be very careful because they have very specific ways the way they want to be referred to, and you need to listen and pay attention to how people want to be addressed.
Right, that's an important point, definitely. Has anyone else had any experiences they want to share related to this topic?
Yeah, I think like I have found that to your point, like we really do have to know whether or not they're legally married. Like I'm on the lending side of things, but I think on the real estate side of things as well, like we need to know how to set up title properly and pursuant to North Carolina state law. Like we need to know. But I found that always going with the more general and inclusive option offends no one. Like I can refer to everybody as partners, and I've yet to meet someone, married or not, who's offended by that. And in the same vein, I've found that with pronouns, with putting my pronouns on my email signature is a super easy way to just inclusively let people know it's okay to share their pronouns with me. And so like my team, I let them know the preferred pronouns when we're getting ready to process a loan so that they're referring to clients in the way they want to be referred to. It takes a minute up front, but it helps people feel a lot more comfortable during the whole process.
Chris, can you use an example of
Can you repeat that?
Can you use an example of your pronouns?
So I use like my email signature underneath my name lists my pronouns of he, him, and his. So if someone's referring to me, it would be, his email address is. But if I don't know someone's preferred pronouns, I try to use gender neutral pronouns like they, just because it's not going to offend anyone, and it helps me avoid potentially offending someone else. So.
I'm not sure if it's mentioned there, but for example, and I think I have done it with you, Chris, like if I refer a client or potential buyer, I will say, oh, they're Spanish speaking. No, I changed it recently saying preferred language, Spanish, for example, just to avoid, and I guess with all these wording that has been changed. And to be honest, it's really not difficult for me because I'm coming from a very diverse country where all of this was not an issue for me. But here you need to be it seems like we have to be very careful about how we use those wording, not to offend either way, either you're people of color, consider white, whatever it is. But those things goes as long with your background, like just the language is also something that will be considered offensive if you don't put it there. or how do we use those wordings?
Right, and that's something when we think about diversity and inclusion, language is definitely a component of that. It's part of, you know, people's culture and identity and sometimes ethnicity. And that I feel like, again, is kind of another separate kind of conversation that we can have about doing work in a multicultural environment and how to navigate those and working with people that may speak a different language than us or come from a place, a different country, and are used to doing business in a different way and communicating in a different way. And so I do agree that that's definitely a consideration when we think about the inclusive language that we are using.
Nicole, I have a question maybe you can answer. So on our loan applications, we have to indicate ethnicity as being Hispanic or non-Hispanic.
Mm-hmm.
And I have found that I have a lot of, especially younger Hispanic American clients and friends that like kind of don't understand why that's a separate distinction from race. And I don't know that I have a great answer for it other than like governmental tracking purposes for discrimination, like to see if Hispanics specifically are getting discriminated against. But
Chris, and to be honest, that is considered offensive for an Hispanic that was born here.
Right.
Because you know they consider, hey, you're trying to put Black me into the Hispanic group as the minority. So
yeah, no, you're exactly right. It is a government kind of way to track discrimination, and specifically started in the Reagan era. So the term Hispanic was coined during Reagan's presidency as the population of people from Latin American countries were coming to the United States. There wasn't kind of a way to ensure that their rights were protected. And so that's why we started seeing, number one, those terms on federal kind of loan applications or documents and things like that. And also, as we know, that term is even considered outdated now by a lot of people from Latin American countries, or again, there are so many different kind of ways that people identify when they are born in a certain country and live here, born in the United States, but have a tie to a different country. So there are so many kind of different things associated with people's ethnicities and identities when it comes to their kind of cultural heritage as well. And I do feel like that's kind of another lunch session that we can have just on that. But you are right about kind of the origins of that question, especially when it comes to loan applications. All right, so we're getting close on time. I just want to make sure we have enough time to get through some of these other discussions. And so again, this is this is not comprehensive. I just put a few things on here with relation to some terms in the real estate space that we are familiar with. The master bedroom, master bathroom, master closet. These terms we're getting away from. Master does have this connotation that's tied to enslaved people. And so an easy alternative is to refer to the largest room in a house as the principal suite, the main bedroom, the owner's suite, things like that. So those are some alternatives that can be used to replace that language. Unfortunately, our MLS has not changed that. And so it still will appear in listings, but when we're referring to properties or showing properties to people or have the opportunity to type out the word or use a different word, not in the MLS, terms like this on the right are ones that, are a nice inclusive term to use. His and hers closets, again, kind of an outdated term, and we shouldn't assume that everyone buying a house, there's a him and a her, right? So we can just say dual closets, or we can just say walk-in closets. We don't have to gender closets. That's not necessary anymore. The man cave, we know, had its moment. So, again, we shouldn't assume, like in the case of Pat's daughter and daughter-in-law, maybe they want a man cave. They're not going to call it a man cave, right? It's going to be the den or the lounge or their hangout spot. The she shed, of course, had its moment as well. It doesn't just have to be for she's. It could just be a shed or a workshop. Landlord is a term that it's good to transition away from, because again, this has connotations and kind of dominance and an impression when it comes to land ownership. And so property owner is a nice alternative to landlord. bachelor pad. Why should bachelors have all the fun? We can just say it's a cool dwelling. It doesn't have to be a bachelor pad. And so these are just some examples of terms that we commonly use in our profession that are gendered in some way or have some kind of connotation that can be offensive to certain populations or communities. And again, this is not inclusive at all. So I did want to open it up to see if people have had experiences with other terms that they found problematic or that their clients have reacted to, or things that we should add to this list.
I've got a story. It's probably been about a year ago. It was a local-ish listing. It was somewhere north, close to the Virginia border, Warrenton or Milton, somewhere up there. It was a house built in the 1800s. And it was the cringiest description. I shared it around the office as a, holy cow, how did this get past how many people? It essentially was like, don't you miss the antebellum era? Like, it was the worst choice. Every single word they chose was the wrong thing to say. It was seriously like, I wish we could go back to the 1860s was what the ad said. And it was really, really stunning that it ran, so maybe if you are selling an older home or something, think about not harking back to something, even if it's, hey, the cool 50s look or something, like just, it was weird.
Yeah, I agree. And that's a good point. I think sometimes we have positive connotations of certain time periods that are positive for us, but maybe for other people, it's not something that was a positive time period for their communities or that person in particular. So that's another kind of way to avoid offending someone, right? And to be more inclusionary. We don't have to talk about that era. We can talk about the property and keep it about, the features of the property. Does anyone else have any experiences around that or words or terms that they'd like to add to the list?
Jack and Jill bath now is a shared adjoining bath as
That's a
opposed
good
to.
one. Yep. Any others?
It's very interesting as we go through the reckoning, the number of neighborhoods that are some type of plantation, which is, and you realize now, oh, how offensive can that be to somebody? You don't even realize it. And I know there's a neighborhood in Carborough that recently got its name, re-recorded its name, is no longer a plantation. They redid themselves. And I think that's something that we as realtors need to probably push on homeowners association. Hey, this might be something that you might want to change. This is not an inclusive description.
Right. And that's a good point. Like I was saying before, we're lucky enough to be kind of the first line of defense as we work with home builders or developers to be a voice for people that will be their customers and clients, and make sure that we are advocating for inclusivity from the beginning of these projects, right? If people are thinking about names or naming of a development or a subdivision, let's try to be as inclusive as possible and not kind of harken back to these eras of time, like the antebellum reference that Virginia mentioned, or words like plantation that can be offensive and exclusionary to some communities. And so
what about Governors Club?
Governors Club?
Yeah. I'm just asking.
You can take that on. You want
to is that inclusive? I don't know. Is that inclusive?
Well, how do you feel when you hear that? What feelings does it evoke for you?
For me, it was just a name, but because of all of this, I just come up with a word. Okay, Governors Club.
Yeah, the real interesting thing with Governor's Club, although they are now named for, all the streets are named for past governors of North Carolina, and several of those governors have come under heat because they were slave owners or segregationists in the past and whatnot. And I know that that's created some issues on public campuses and stuff, but I don't think those names are going to change in Governor's Club anytime soon.
Yeah.
Well, Gail Claris commented in the chat that we should speak to the HBA about that. And certainly if you live in a community that you think might be causing any kind of problem, hurting anybody, speaking to your homeowners association would be a good way to start as well.
Again, I just used it because of all the different things. It was nothing to make it.
Right,
Just being funny. I'm just.
Yeah, thanks, Sanara.
All right. And so this is a place where I thought we can have some additional discussion, because in addition to, specific real estate terms and referring to people, there are some terms that we use when we're describing properties. And so this is something that we were just talking about earlier with the older house that Virginia was referencing. So some terms that we just use that's commonplace for us, like up and coming, transitioning neighborhood, gentrified, a good neighborhood, things like this. These are terms that are kind of coded in how we're communicating the status of that neighborhood, the socioeconomic situation of the people that live there, the kind of location and desirability of it. And so when we think about the words that we use when we're describing neighborhoods and places, we also have to think about how we're describing the people that live there and why it could be offensive. And so when you see these words just on the left here, are there any that you feel like there's a good alternative to those types of descriptors? Feel free to shout out any ideas or suggestions.
What is the meaning of gentrified?
Gentrified?
Mm-hmm.
So this is a term that is commonly used for a neighborhood that is traditionally predominantly a community of color, and white people come and move into it. So that's kind of the context of gentrification.
Okay.
When you talk about housing equity, Nicole, the gentrification of some of our neighborhoods is creating some real disparities in ownership. I looked at some neighborhoods in Durham which have been traditionally neighborhoods of color, and all of a sudden we're now gentrifying those neighborhoods, and they're becoming the place to be, and all of a sudden we're not replacing the housing that's there for the people that are there. How do we address that?
Well, that's definitely kind of a systematic community effort that we have to do. But it does highlight this kind of continual cycle that communities of color have experienced when it comes to displacement and disparity in the housing sense and disinvestment. So there's this cycle of disinvestment, gentrification, and then kind of displacement that has traditionally happened in urban environments across the US. And so Durham is not unique to this, and this is something that the Fair Housing Act hoped to address, but in some ways it actually made the problem worse because there was white flight to the suburbs, and then people came back to the cities, and there was no kind of efforts to measure these types of cycles of disinvestment and displacement. And so this is a large systematic issue on various levels of government, federal government, local government, and obviously community members that have some kind of influence and impact in this. And that's a lot of the work that I do in the community, efforts with affordable housing that I work in. And I'm happy to have those discussions. We can continue these types of discussions, within the association. And I do think it is important to kind of think about those systematic issues too when we talk about housing, especially fair housing and access to housing.
Nicole, on the term gentrification, is it just a color issue, or is it more of an affordability issue? Because I do see communities where people of color with money are coming in, and you get all different people bringing in a lot of money, redoing homes, tearing down. And so it becomes more of an affordability issue for people who are remaining, who feel that they're being pushed out because of people building these like larger, bigger homes, the taxes end up going up, values go up, but their taxes go up as well, and they can no longer afford to stay in the neighborhood.
Yeah, I would say usually any neighborhood that's been gentrified or communities that have experienced gentrification, there's a strong correlation to those being white people moving in. So generally it's not going to be a community of color that's affected by another community of color coming in, and that probably would not be considered gentrification. The idea of people of color moving into a neighborhood and gentrifying it just is not the norm. It generally is white people of means moving into an underinvested community of color, and that's where you get the gentrification context.
Okay.
So I do know we're short on time. Again, I will share this presentation to make sure that everyone has access to it, and I'm happy to continue this discussion. But I did want to talk a little bit about coded language in real estate. And coded language is, again, sometimes these things that we're just so ingrained in us and we're used to just kind of saying without thinking that it is problematic. And these are things that I probably have said and not even realized it, right? You just say it because it's part of our vernacular when it comes to real estate and working with our clients and customers. But it does kind of reinforce some of the stereotypes associated with certain types of neighborhood or certain types of people and things like that. And so these are some terms to think about when you are describing words and working with people. So pride and ownership, I'm just going to go through a couple of these. Pride and ownership is something that I hear my colleagues say a lot. When you go to, for instance, the Governor's Club and everything is perfectly manicured and things like that. Just because something's perfectly manicured and you see a neighborhood where it's not, doesn't mean there's no pride and ownership. And so we want to make sure that those types of disparities with socioeconomic class we're not communicating those to the people that we're interacting with professionally. And so these are just some of the examples of coded words that we use. I'm sure we all know what safe means when our clients or customers say they want a safe neighborhood. Usually safe is a code word for not a community of color because there's association with high crime in communities of color. And so when someone's asking for a safe neighborhood, you should probably think twice about what they're really asking you. Good schools is another term that people like to use as a coded way to identify the socioeconomic class of a community or the demographics of a community. Reference to renters or apartments, again, this negative connotation of people that are not homeowners. So these are just some terms that we generally use. You might see in listings. There are things that you kind of talk about when you're working with clients and customers that we just need to take another look at. And I know, do we have a hard stop at 1? I just want to make sure I'm not.
We do. I so appreciate this. It is 1 o'clock and I know we want to be respectful of everyone's time. So I think I'm going to.
And you can send this presentation out. I do just want to say, this is just kind of touching the topic, right? Inclusion and equity is way beyond race. There's so many ways that privilege is exercised. And so this is just an illustration showing that. And hopefully we can continue these conversations within OCHAR in the future. And these are just some other examples of how we can be more inclusive. We touched on some of these topics, but it is a very deep and complex subject. And I just, there's some guidance in here for people too. And similar to what Chris was alluding to as well, we just want to just get off on the right foot from the beginning. So these are some alternatives to when you're starting communication with people. Let's make sure that we're inclusive and using that inclusive language when we are starting our relationships with customers and clients.
Nicole, I can't tell you how much we appreciate this. You've introduced the topic. I hope that all of you who've been attended today and all of those of you who are watching this later, please continue the conversations in your offices among your fellow realtors. This is a great month to have these discussions because we have so many resources available that are being made available to us. In addition, I want to make sure that you're all aware that on May 5th, we're going to have a regional session that will be dealing with this topic a little bit more, and why I can't scroll down and tell you, yes, it's Bill Dedman's Lessons Learned from the Long Island Divided. And it's going to be a great meeting. And I certainly hope that you follow the links to sign up for that. There will be more about that coming from the association to you. Please, please consider signing up. Thank you again, Nicole. This was fabulous. And to all of you, have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye now.
Bye.